When a good therapist leaves this work, everyone calls it burnout. But burnout is the last chapter for that therapist. The real story started months or even years before anyone even noticed. And if you're a therapist who's thought about leaving your job, or you've already watched colleagues walk away, you probably already know that. You know it wasn't just one thing that did it in. It was a slow accumulation of things that had nothing to do with the client sitting across from you, right? And hold on, before we get into all this, if you don't know me, hi, I'm Jenny Hughes, trauma psychologist and founder of the Brave Trauma Therapist Collective, which is a space where we make sure that trauma therapists have something left for themselves at the end of each day. And real quick, tell me, where are you on this one? If you've ever thought about leaving the field, or maybe you already have, just drop the number 1 in the comments. And maybe you're a clinical director or practice owner watching this in real time. Tell me, drop a number 2 here. I just want to know who's watching so I can keep making content to help you. And last thing, before we get into the reason that good therapists leave, I did make a free Vicarious Trauma Tracker plus bonus mini course for therapists who want to start paying attention to all the things that are accumulating before it hits that tipping point. The link is below in the description, okay? Now, as we get into the reasons that good therapists leave this work, you're going to notice that none of these happen overnight. Every single one is a slow build. The kind of thing that starts as a small frustration and then compounds over and over until one day that therapist isn't frustrated anymore. They're done, right? So let's get started. Number 1, professional isolation. This is not a shocker, right? And listen to me here. Trauma therapists carry some of the heaviest clinical material in the mental health field. We're talking about complex PTSD, child abuse, sexual violence, community violence, intergenerational trauma, you name it. And most of them are carrying that without a single peer who truly gets what it's like to sit in that room day after day. Yeah, you might have coworkers, you might even have supervision or consultation, but supervision in most settings is about the case. Of course, understandably, it's about treatment planning, documentation, risk management, all necessary, right? I'm not here to argue that, but it rarely also gets to be a space that's about the therapist. It's rarely someone asking, hey, how you holding up with all of this? And then normalizing the impact of trauma work on the therapist. When no one is checking on the human doing the work, when the only conversations happening are clinical and logistical, you start to feel invisible in a really specific way. Not invisible as a clinician. You're needed for those RVUs, right? Invisible as a person. And that feeling doesn't show up in week 1. It is the slow erosion of feeling unseen that builds over months and years until leaving feels like the only form of self-preservation. Reason number 2, chronic invalidation of the emotional weight. It's the just leave it at the office. Well, you knew what you signed up for. At least you're not the one going through it. If you've been a trauma therapist for even 2 minutes, you've heard some version of this, right? You may have heard it from a supervisor or a professor, or maybe it came from a partner or a friend who just has no idea what it's actually like to hold space for someone else's worst moments over and over again every single day. And I know you love your job and you wouldn't have it any other way. And here's what happens when you hear that enough times. You stop talking about it. You stop bringing it up because every time you do, the response from that person tells you that what you're carrying isn't that heavy or that it shouldn't be. And when you stop talking about it, you start internalizing it. You start believing that maybe something actually is wrong with you for struggling, for having human feelings, that you should be stronger, more boundaried, more resilient, more something, you fill in the blank. And that belief does not form overnight. It calcifies slowly, right? One dismissive comment at a time until the therapist who used to process openly goes quiet. And no one notices because quiet looks a lot like fine. Number 3, administrative burden that has nothing to do with the clinical work. This one builds so gradually that most therapists don't even realize how much it has shifted until they are drowning in it. We're talking all the documentation requirements, insurance authorizations, the productivity quotas, outcome measures, compliance trainings that have nothing to do with your actual clinical practice. And I know, these are necessary evils of a managed care system, right? And you know what? The ratio of paperwork to client contact keeps shifting, and it almost always shifts in one direction. More documentation, more hoops, more time spent justifying the work instead of doing the work. And at some point, a therapist looks at their week and realizes that they're spending more energy fighting the fucking broken system than actually helping people. This is the kind of thing that's tolerable in year one, right? You tell yourself it's just part of the job. By year 3, it is soul crushing because you didn't become a trauma therapist to spend your evenings writing notes. You became one because you believe that people can heal. And every hour spent on administrative tasks is an hour that reminds you that the system does not prioritize that the way that you do. Number 4, no pathway for growth that doesn't mean leaving clinical work. This is one that we really do not talk about enough. In most organizations, the only promotion available to a clinician is moving into management, right? Becoming a supervisor, a director, taking on administrative leadership. And all of those roles by design pull you further away from the clinical work that drew you into this field in the first place. And at first, that can feel good when you have been dealing with so much burnout. But what happens to the therapist who loves being in the room with clients, who has spent years developing clinical expertise and doesn't want to trade that for spreadsheets and staff meetings every single day? In most settings, therapists hit a ceiling. There's no advanced clinical track. There's no role that says, you can keep doing this work and we will honor that with increased responsibility, compensation, and recognition. When staying in the room with clients is a professional dead end, the most dedicated clinicians start looking for somewhere that values what they actually do, or they leave and go to private practice. Then the organization loses the exact person they could least afford to lose, right? Okay, we're halfway through. And if you're nodding along to any of this, I want you to do something with that. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Whether that's a colleague who's right in the thick of it right now, or maybe a leader at your organization who might not realize what's happening on their team. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is make sure that the right person hears this. All right, on to number 5. Moral injury from systemic constraints. Now, this is different from burnout, and it's important to name that difference, okay? Burnout is the exhaustion, depersonalization, and complete and utter detachment from the work that you love. Moral injury is a wound. It's what happens when you're trained to provide evidence-based, trauma-informed care and then told that you can't. Not because you don't know how, but because the system won't let you. So what does this look like? It's the session limits that cut treatment short just as a client is starting to get somewhere. Caseload numbers that make it impossible to provide the kind of care that you know works and is necessary. Organizational policies that prioritize throughput over outcomes. Authorization requirements that force you to justify why a trauma survivor needs more than 6 sessions. And the gap between what you know your client needs and what you're allowed to provide creates this wound that self-care is not going to be able to touch. No amount of yoga or deep breathing fixes the experience of watching a client lose access to care because of a policy decision made by someone who has never sat in a therapy room. That wound widens with every case where your hands are tied. And over time, it stops feeling like a frustration and it starts being a betrayal of the very reason you do this work. Reason number 6, lack of clinical community and real consultation. Now, this is different from the isolation I talked about in number 1. Professional isolation is about being alone in the work. This is about not having a space where you can bring your hardest clinical moments without fear of judgment or evaluation from your peers, your colleagues, your supervisors, okay? Did you know that most therapists don't have a single colleague they can be fully honest with about what's really happening in their clinical work? Like the case that scares them, the session where they froze, the client they're not sure they're helping, or the moment they question whether they're even good at this. And that's not because they don't want that kind of space. It's because most of the professional spaces that are available to them aren't actually safe for that level of honesty. Supervision often has to be evaluative. Team meetings can be real performative. Peer consultation, when it exists, can feel more like a case presentation than genuine support. And do not even get me started on the therapist Facebook groups, okay? But when a therapist doesn't have a space where they can be fully human about the work, they carry everything alone. And carrying it all alone is not sustainable for months, let alone years. And real quick, side note on this point, if you want to know what it actually looks like when that kind of consultation does exist, I did a whole video on the 12 green flags of a consultation group that's actually safe. I'll link it up here and in the description below. All right, reason number 7 that good therapists leave this work. It's leadership that treats wellness as a perk, not infrastructure. I'm talking about the pizza parties, wellness committees, a one-time training on stress management, an email reminding staff to practice self-care this weekend. As well-intentioned as these are, when organizations treat clinician well-being as a nice to have or something to address with occasional gestures rather than structural investment, therapists hear the message loud and clear. Your sustainability is your problem. We'll give you an acknowledgement here and there, but the actual architecture of how we run this organization isn't going to change. And that message, repeated over years, is what turns a committed therapist into someone updating their resume. Because it's not the absence of pizza parties that makes people leave. It's the realization that the organization they've given their career to doesn't understand the difference between a gesture and a commitment, between acknowledging that the work is hard and actually building systems that account for that. I was listening to an interview recently with Melinda French Gates, and she was talking about what it was like to come up in Microsoft in the early days and how as she climbed the corporate ladder, as she became a leader, she started to realize that people were coming to her team that other teams were after. These amazing coders and designers were all seeking her out, even though she was in consumer support. And people kept asking her, like, Melinda, how did you get X, Y, and Z to be on your team? And what she realized was it was the culture of her team that was bringing all of these rock stars in, that was building up all the work that she was doing, even if it wasn't to make the hottest, coolest new thing on Microsoft's offer list. Okay. So unrelated example, but something that is really tangible, that makes sense, and is exactly what we're talking about here in number 7. Okay. Here's our final reason. Number 8. The final reason that therapists leave this work, which is the absence of anyone even noticing until it's too late. By the time a therapist is handing in their resignation, that decision was made months ago, sometimes even longer. The signs were there the whole time. The withdrawal from team interactions, the cynicism that used to be humor, the disengagement from things that they used to care about. The therapist who always volunteered for the difficult cases and loved them, suddenly silent in staffings. But no one had a framework for catching it early. No one was trained to look for it. And so the organization only realizes when the resignation letter lands. And by then, the therapist has already grieved the whole leaving process. They've moved through it and moved on emotionally. The conversation that could have happened 18 months ago, it's not on the table anymore. And this is maybe the most important point of all of these, because every single reason I just walked through is visible if someone knows where to look and is actually looking. The slow creep really is slow, but it's not invisible. It just requires someone building the kind of system that pays attention before the last chapter. So here's the thing I want you to sit with. Yeah, burnout's the final chapter, but these 8 things are the story that leads there. And most of them have been building for far longer than anyone realized. The therapist did not burn out in just one day. The conditions were all set, sometimes years in advance, by systems and cultures and decisions that no one thought to examine. And the reason this matters, the reason I'm making this video, is that every single one of these is changeable. Not by the individual therapist trying harder, pushing through, or finding a better morning routine, though. It's changeable by the systems and leaders around them choosing to do something different, choosing to look at the infrastructure instead of the individual. So if you're a clinical director, practice owner, organizational leader, and you're recognizing your team in what I just described, this is exactly what I train on in the BRAVE method. I work with trauma-exposed organizations to build the kind of infrastructure that keeps good therapists from reaching that last chapter. Things like sustainable consultation structures, leadership frameworks that actually account for vicarious trauma, and systems that catch the slow creep before it becomes a resignation. You can learn more at braveproviders.com/speaking, and that link is of course in the description too. And if you're a therapist who watched this and thought, I wish my leadership understood this, you can send them this video. Sometimes the conversation starts with someone else's words. You don't have to be the one to explain it, but maybe you're the person to make sure they hear it. Because trauma therapists, they weren't meant to carry this work alone. And they definitely were not meant to leave it just because no one built a system that could hold them. So with that, I want you to be human. I'm doing my best to, and I'll catch you in the next video.